and welcome to this month's episode of Clarity Presents. Today we've got Piers Bishop with us, who is the co-founder of WeThrive. We're going to be looking at personal and business and how the two can potentially combine. So hi Piers, thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Thank you.
So as I said, we're going to be looking at the potential disruption between personal and business and whether or not we can find that elusive balance. So how can a business actually help employees with the nirvana of this work-life balance?
Work-life balance. I think half the problem is the phrase work-life balance, because the idea that you've got work and life and that if one goes up, the other one must go down because they're in a balance of some kind. I think that's quite a problematic idea because it puts a tension between the two things, and it suggests to employees that if they're going to be working harder, they'll somehow have less life, So I think if we could get rid of that phrase, that would be a big step forward. Part of the problem is that we actually want the same things out of life, whether we're at home or whether we're at work. And if we could start to think about how to dissolve the boundaries in thinking between those two environments, that would be hugely helpful. Because wherever you are, whether you're at home or whether you're here at work, you want to feel secure, you want to feel in control, have some autonomy over how you operate. You want to be connected with other people. You want to be doing things that are interesting and useful. You want to have a meaningful time. Now you want that whether you're at home, whether you're at work, whether you're out traveling for work or for pleasure. So I think if we could somehow get people to consider those elements of what people need in life rather than the particular constraints of working travel policy or how people want to be able to use their time at work, rather than have it inside those boxes. If we could just think about what human beings need overall, that would be a marvellous start.
So it's much more of a life balance. It is your life and ensuring you have a nice balanced life.
Well, it is your life, and if you're an employer and you're employing somebody, you're buying part of their life. And you have to do them the honour, I think, of allowing them to have, as far as is possible within the operations of the business, to have the same things in place in their life, like security, control, autonomy, all those sort of things, as far as possible when they're at work. Because if you don't, they'll become upset, because those are fundamental emotional needs. And when people become upset, all manner of things change inside their heads and inside their bodies as well. People, when they become upset, they start to breathe faster, their heart rate goes up, the blood pressure goes up. In the long run, they become ill. People who are stressed over long periods actually are more likely to go sick. So there are huge downsides to taking away from people's autonomy, and that's a theme I'm sure we'll come back to when talking about how you choose to organise business travel and what degree of autonomy you give people.
Yes, I mean that absolutely is a really hot topic at the moment. Of the autonomy and personalisation is a massive theme at the minute of travel versus cost and control. And again, it comes back to that hearts and minds. The hearts and the traveller is wanting the freedom, wanting the autonomy to choose and to gain the life balance. But the travel manager may not necessarily have the same motivations in mind, and they want to control costs, want to be efficient, and control the traveller to a degree. So looking at that, how do you feel that the two could be more aligned? Is there a way that we can do that, maintain cost and control, but still allow a feeling of autonomy?
I think there are multiple ways you could do it. One thing that's interesting here is that a lot of businesses are actually behind the government in, for example, the field of personal healthcare, where people have to be looked after, usually in later life. Historically, there was a fixed budget, or a government department provided a service. But increasingly, people are being given personal independence budgets, which they can spend on the kind of care that suits them, at the times and in the ways that suits them. And you'd think, well, that would be a luxurious offering from the government, that would be an unnecessary and expensive luxury. But actually it turns out that if you treat people that way, the health improves and it often costs less. So the overall cost to the state in the long run is actually reduced if you give people choice over how they spend their money. Now, maybe there are ways in which travel managers could take a lesson from that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think some lessons are being learnt by some of the larger organisations who are taking that tack of allowing their travellers to have that freedom and actually finding that they treat the spend as their own spend. They are much more responsible with that. So there are ways that it can be brought together, but it's such a step change, I think, for businesses to adopt a more traveller-centric focus, as with the government adopting a more patient-centric focus rather than focusing purely on the budgets. So, I mean, looking at kind of the travel and allowing people to focus on what's important to them. There's a brilliant blog on your website that I noticed about how people can be overworked, and if they're overworked, then the productivity decreases. Travel, obviously, can often be tacked on to the beginning or the end of a day, leading to that feeling of tiredness and being overworked, doing a 14-hour day because of travel rather than an 8. What are the risks to business about not getting that balance right and asking for this level of overwork or level of travel? How can that negatively impact them?
Well, there are legal risks for a start. I mean, when, for example, television all changed and huge numbers of independent production companies started springing up, people were being paid, crews were being paid on a contract basis. You get there however you want, you do the job, you're paid for the job, you get home, traveling's not our problem, you sort it out. Right. And people died as a result, working long shifts and doing long travelling times either side of those. And so progressively the industry sorted itself out and started to bring that back under control, and now there are people responsible for managing how people travel and how much time they actually work during a day. And there's a very good legal reason for doing that, and there's a very good humanitarian reason for doing it, because you just don't want people suffering in the long run. Now, in the case of business travel where it's a reasonably measured length of a commute either side, or a travel away to some customer's base either side of a normal working day, you could argue that you're taking away from what would be somebody's leisure time, yes, somebody's time with their family. And in the long run, or even in the short term in some cases, that will have a number of possible effects. There's no free ride. If you take people's time, you have to give them something in return. You give them respect, you give them control, you give them money, you give them time off in lieu, you give them options over how they arrange it so that they can choose to go early or go the night before and take a hotel or whatever. But the more choice you give them, the more bargaining power you give them within the constraints of what's right for the business, then the better it will be in the long run in terms of sickness, staff retention, and also the good functioning that you want out of people. Because if they arrive tired, if they build up an overtiredness over several days, it will affect their intelligence, it'll affect their bargaining ability, it'll affect their ability to think. Not only to think straight, but to think outside the box as well. It'll affect people's ability to be creative and imaginative, all of which are the things that you generally want in the knowledge economy out of the people who are working for you. The problem for the organisation is working out where the balance should really fit. Yeah. How much control should you give people? How much spend should you allow them to make? And to understand where the best point, the optimal point is, you've got to experiment. It's no good just saying, well, our budget is X, because if people can get away with spending less, they will, and try and save the rest if they can possibly do that. If they have to spend more, then they'll either spend it out of their own pockets and resent the company, or they'll spend it on a company card and then having to spend time arguing with the travel manager over whether that should have been justified or not, all of which is time that comes out of what should be the thinking time budget, yes, for that employee. So there's no upside to having that kind of conflict. It just takes away from everybody's time, makes people cross, costs the company money in the short and long run. So you have to experiment. You have to, as an organisation, you have to say, what's the best way to manage this? It isn't going to be a fixed budget, especially not with younger employees who are used to negotiating everything, who are used to interviewing the company when they come in and say, how do you organise these things? Because I need to know if I'm going to go to wherever, if I'm going to have to go to the other end of a country to see a client. I want to know that I'm going to be looked after. So you've got to experiment. You've got to find out what is the optimum way of organising it, and it won't necessarily be the same for each individual, won't necessarily be the same for each age group, won't necessarily be the same for each band of employee within the organisation. But it's very clear that the more you can do to think about the needs and desires of the people who are actually ultimately out on the road for your company, the more you can consider those, the more likely it is that they will arrive refreshed and happy and motivated. There's nothing more demotivating than feeling you're being put into a machine and told how to behave, forced to do things in a particular way, even when you know there might be better ways of organising it.
Absolutely. And I think we are seeing that as a general business trend. More and more people now at the actual interview stage are asking about travel policy, which has been previously unheard of. It'd be a case of, you got into your role, you then realise, oh, well, actually, I'm expected to get the 4:30 a.m. train to Glasgow every other week. Okay, I've just got to do it. But now people are asking that question and are actually making decisions about which employer they will work for based on things around travel policy. So there's clearly a shift from the traveller wanting to have things much more focused and personalised around them, and it's whether or not we can convince the business side to move forward with that. A lot of the time I think there is a perception that allowing the people to choose and your employees that level of autonomy, which we've discussed, has a negative financial impact. What would you say to that?
You have to do the experiment. If you've got an employee who's got to get to Glasgow very early in the morning once a week, well, why not ask them if they've got an auntie in Glasgow and they want to go up the day before and go and see relatives or what have you? Because if you ask the question, if you don't ask the question, you'll never know. You'll just have somebody who's grumpy because they've got to get that train. If you do ask the question, you probably find out things that will work to everybody's advantage. Not just because you'll have a happier employee, which will be a more motivated and more loyal employee, but also because there will be potential synergies that you might otherwise never know about. And also because in the long run, the costs that are being accumulated unseen by people being forced to work and travel in particular ways that don't really work for them, those costs accumulate. And they may take months, years, possibly even decades to wash through as stress, as illness, as regretted loss, and as day-to-day grumpiness and uncooperativeness. There's an awful lot of that in people who would like to be able to do A, but are just have to do B. And it applies to travel just as much as to any other area of working life. And we haven't really even begun to understand how much variation there is between people in the way they want to be able to work. We've got this picture of the employee as if there was an employee, and there isn't. Even among people who are apparently on the face of it quite similar, there are huge differences, and the more you drill down into elements of people's character and elements of people's history and experience and knowledge and ability, the more it becomes obvious that actually there is no average, there are no two people alike. Take a company with 4,000 people in, there will not be two people the same inside there. And until you start asking the questions and thinking about what the variability is and what it means, you'll never know what you stand to gain by understanding it and working with it. If you don't do that, you're always working against the grain of your employees.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I think that whole premise of communication, of understanding, of taking the time to find out, understand and then act upon the information that you've gleaned from your employees and bringing together the hearts and minds, essentially. That's the whole crux of it, I guess, isn't it? Bringing together the understanding of what the motivations for the travellers are, the motivations for the business, and finding that perfect balance and shared point and shared aspect for both of them.
Now, what you want from the people here and in every other office around the country is you want people to be able to use their brains. You want them to be able to use their mental capacities to the full, and you want them to be reasonably calm and happy and settled inside themselves too, because otherwise the people they're talking to you on your behalf, the clients of your company, will sense that they're unsettled and they won't get the same kind of cooperation, they won't get the same kind of deals. The world has changed so much since the machine age finally gave way to the information age, and we haven't seen anything yet. And the degree to which this element of personal understanding, of being able to drive past the averages, past the overall data for the company. And because we're spending so much more time now traveling from place to place, it's going to become increasingly important for companies to understand as much as they can about the individual best patterns for each employee. It sounds like a lot of work. It sounds like an effort that travel managers might prefer not to go to. But the long-term downside, with the millennial employees particularly saying, well, no, I don't want that actually, I'm not used to being treated like that, is something we're only just beginning to see the front end of now. And in 20 years' time, the company that says, right, your budget is this, you go on that train and so on and so on, there'll be nobody who wants to work for them.
No. That's such a great point, and I do agree. The world is progressing, technology is progressing, expectations are progressing, and therefore, as an industry, travel needs to progress too. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Piers. It's been fantastic talking to you and some great insight there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
On our next episode of Clarity Presents, we'll be looking at wellbeing and profit. We look forward to you joining us then.